Thank you. So first of all, can you hear me? Great. Okay. So thanks a lot for the introduction, and remote thanks also for Leila for the very kind intro video that Christoph was commenting on. And thanks above all for the invitation to give this talk to all here. It's a great pleasure. I will present work that was done jointly with my colleagues and collaborators Ahmad Abu Akel, a psychologist from the University of Lausanne, and Andreas Spitz, who did this work when he was a postdoc at EPFL and who has since moved to Konstanz to become a professor there. So the starting point of this work is the same as for so much work in our IC2S2 community, namely that soaring polarization, a decrease in civility are a major challenge to today's societies. The trust in mainstream media and mutual esteem between people of different political convictions have plummeted drastically over the last 2 decades, and partisanship among politicians has sharply increased. This phenomenon is especially stark in the US. This is a US picture, of course, but it's a global problem. Now, of course, people have always disagreed with each other, but today's situation is also distinct in important aspects. In an online setting on the web, extreme opinions, biased information, and fabricated false facts are proliferating and amplifying in echo chambers with a reach and speed that was unimaginable before. For instance, these offline scenes that I showed were possible only because of massive online radicalization that had happened in advance. And in this project that I will talk about, we aim to confront these alarming trends and to understand and fight polarization with the ultimate goal of making the web a more civil place. Of course, there has been quite a bunch of prior work on decreasing polarization. A lot of that work shares a common good idea, namely that to explicitly expose users to content from across the aisle. The bad news is that usually this is not effective, and it can even be counter-effective. There's the famous backfire effect that says that sometimes when you oppose people to an opposite opinion, they will curl up and harden the opinion that they had already held before. The psychological explanation for this is probably to be found in cognitive dissonance. So when we are confronted with opposing views, then there is this mismatch between the input and the current state in our minds, and this creates some sort of mental discomfort, and people by all means usually try to avoid these things. And one mechanism to cope with cognitive dissonance is confirmation bias, where people more easily accept opinions that support their own opinions and dismiss opposite opinions that are far from their own. There is a silver lining, however. In what I would consider quite important work by the late Émile Bruno and others, what was investigated was the impact of various nudging strategies that were put in place in order to get people to revise their extreme opinions. And these nudges were delivered in the form of short video clips, where people, basically stuff that you can find on Vimeo, but carefully selected video clips. And out of these, and the researchers basically A/B tested those video clips in order to see how effective they were at making people open their minds. And interestingly, out of those 8 strategies that they tested, only one was effective. All others had no impact on opinion change. The one that worked was what they titled highlighting hypocrisy. So I'll explain that quickly with an example. Imagine that there is someone who holds a grudge against Muslims, who is prejudiced against Muslims, and he or she collectively blames Muslims for the acts of violence that are committed by single Muslim terrorists. The strategy that worked in order to get people away from this prejudiced opinion was to make it clear to them that they would not apply the same standards to Christian acts of violence. So they would not blame collectively Christians for example, terrorist acts committed by the Ku Klux Klan. And so the takeaway here is that exposure to opposite opinions can work if it's done carefully. And it was this work from psychology that really motivated us to start scouting for additional ways of decreasing polarization. And our idea here was around celebrities. Psychology has shown that people frequently identify with celebrities, building a sort of pseudo-personal one-way rapport with them. Marketers, of course, have been leveraging this phenomenon for a long time by using celebrities as spokespersons in product ads. Here, for instance, you have top model Claudia Schiffer in a 1993 commercial where she advertises a soda pop, Fanta. It's of course a ludicrous combination because probably Claudia Schiffer hasn't been close to a bottle of Fanta in the last 50 years. So we were thinking, if people buy Fanta because Claudia Schiffer tells them to do so, it seems reasonable to suspect that people might also be more willing to accept an opposing opinion if it comes from a celebrity whom they know, like, and trust. For example, can we use Claudia Schiffer as a spokesperson for climate change awareness? In order to motivate our approach, let me ask you a question, and I'm moving away for better or worse from Claudia Schiffer and moving towards other celebrities. Let me ask you, whom would you trust more on climate change? Al Gore or Arnold Schwarzenegger? We all know that Al Gore is a big champion of climate change awareness. Here's a quote by him. Well, the title, An Inconvenient Truth, is a way of highlighting the reasons why some people, including the president, don't seem to accept the truth. So he's clearly an outspoken climate change awareness advocate. But this is also the case for Arnold Schwarzenegger. When he was governor of California, he proclaimed the future is green energy, sustainability, renewable energy. So let's get back to that question. Whom would you trust more on climate change? And let me add a little bit of nuance. Whom would you trust more on climate change, assuming you're a climate change skeptic? Al Gore or Arnold Schwarzenegger? Based on these musings, we formulated the following research question. If I want to convince people to open their minds and consider opinions opposite to their own, whom should I enlist as a spokesperson? And we had the following hypotheses when we started the work. We hypothesized that liked, trusted, and respected spokespersons would be more effective at softening extreme opinions than disliked, distrusted, or disrespected spokespersons. For example, I would suspect that there are many people who like exactly one of Arnold Schwarzenegger or Al Gore, but not both. And I would also suspect that a climate change skeptic would be more likely to like Arnold Schwarzenegger than Al Gore. So I would suspect that Arnold Schwarzenegger might be better suited as a climate change awareness spokesperson when our goal is to open up a climate change skeptic's mind about the topic. Broadly, in this work, we shifted the focus from what most previous work had considered, namely how to say it, how to phrase a message, how to frame it, towards the question, who should say it, whom to enlist as a spokesperson for a fixed message. If we want to answer our research question, namely, are liked celebrities more effective as spokespersons than disliked celebrities, we need to study all the combinations of liking, disliking, and agreeing, disagreeing. But of course, liking and agreeing are tightly linked. As you all know, there are phenomena like homophily and social influence that make us, for example, like the people that we agree with. That would be homophily. Birds of a feather flock together, or vice versa, social influence. If we're already friends with someone, if we already like someone, we are more likely to be influenced by them. So then, therefore, to agree with them. So we somehow, to answer our research question, we need to disentangle liking and agreeing, and we did so with a randomized control trial. Here's the general idea. Imagine we have our climate change skeptic. This is Andreas, one of the co-authors. He is, just for full transparency, he's not a climate change skeptic, but I had his picture ready. So here you go. Here's our climate change skeptic who thinks that climate change is natural, nothing to worry about. It happens anyways. And the opposing, disagreeing opinion to that is, of course, that climate change is a problem that we should worry about. Now we have two candidate spokespersons for this statement, Arnold Schwarzenegger and Al Gore, and our climate change skeptic happens to like Arnold Schwarzenegger and dislike Al Gore. What we do now is we flip a coin and we decide whether we should attribute this quotation to Schwarzenegger or to Gore. In this case, the coin comes up heads. And so we have the constellation of Arnold Schwarzenegger proclaiming that climate change is a problem, and we confront our climate change skeptic with this attributed opinion. So this is the constellation, like, disagree. What I described here is the basic idea. In our real study, we explored a few more conditions. And this is what I'll show on this slide. We also added a scientific expert because we thought scientists might have a role to play on certain topics. And we also consider agreeing opinions in certain constellations. When we started the work, we came in with certain hypotheses, and I'll summarize these on this slide. So the question we ask is, will attributing the respective quotation to the respective speaker cause the respondent to soften their opinion on the respective topic, in this case, climate change? We hypothesized that attributing the disagreeing opinion to a disliked celebrity will not be effective at softening the target person's mind. But on the contrary, we hypothesized that attributing this disagreeing opinion to a celebrity that they like and respect would open ways to softening their opinion. We didn't quite know what to expect from the expert, so we didn't commit. And we also expected that attributing an opinion that agrees with yours to someone whom you dislike might steer you away from the opinion that you already have. For the example that I have in my mind is like, Hitler was a vegetarian too. When you tell that to a vegetarian, what does that do to their self-image? It might steer them away from considering vegetarianism the way they used to do. And now, of course, if we turn that around and try to leverage it for good, not to steer people away from vegetarianism, we hypothesized that it might be possible to make people go away from the opinion that they already have by saying that people that they dislike share the same opinion. Okay, so before we can start filling the cells of this matrix, we need to gather quite a lot of info, actually. We need to have controversial topics. We need to have polarized quotes about each of these topics. We need to have a set of spokespersons who could reasonably and conceivably be the source of all these quotations. And then once we have a respondent, we need to know what is their opinion about each of the topics before the intervention starts. And we need to know what is their attitude towards each of the spokespersons. So here I'm quickly summarizing where we get all that information from. We hand-selected 4 controversial topics that are broadly discussed societally. We chose abortion, climate change, immigration, and vaccination. Then we sourced the quotations about these topics from a data set called Quote Bank. I will say a few more words about Quote Bank in a minute. We put together a set of 25 spokespersons. We selected those in a data-driven way such that these spokespersons were likely to be known to a broad public, but also that their opinion about these 4 controversial topics is unlikely to be known to the participants, because we want to make sure that the randomization of quotes to spokespersons makes sense, is realistic. And then finally, the respondents, I should say that we also had the expert spokesperson, right? This was someone that we made up, a fictitious expert. We did not take a real expert because we wanted someone that we could kind of pitch as an expert on all the 4 topics. And it should be someone towards whom the participants had no previous attitude. So we made someone up called Dr. Michael Barnes, and we used this picture. And then the prior attitudes and opinions of the respondents, we elicited those in a screening survey. I will not give any details about the screening survey in this talk. So for the purpose of the talk, just assume that we are given somehow the respondents' prior opinions about the topics and about the spokespersons. So here's a little commercial break. I mentioned Quote Bank earlier. This is the data set from which we sourced the quotations about the topics. It's a massive corpus of hundreds of millions of quotes extracted from hundreds of millions of news articles, English. And importantly, those quotes were automatically using machine learning attributed to their most likely speakers in the article. We think that this data set is useful for computational social science, so we are opening it up. And if you're interested in this data set, please come to the session on novel digital data sources on Friday morning, where Andreas will present this data set. And needless to say, of course, Quote Bank is also endorsed by Claudia Schiffer. Okay, so back to our study. Before we move to the core study design, I'd like to add a few details about how we did the randomization. Remember, we have 4 conditions: disagree, like, disagree, dislike, disagree, expert, and agree, dislike. And now we have our respondent, and we know the respondents' opinions about each of the 4 topics and about all 25 candidate speakers from the screening survey. And the randomization now happens at the time when we map the conditions to the topics. And we do this by randomly assigning each of the 4 topics, climate change, vaccination, immigration, and abortion, to one of the 4 conditions. And so this way, we collect 4 data points per respondent, 1 data point per topic, and in parallel, 1 data point per condition, because each condition is mapped to exactly 1 topic for that respondent. And now in the central piece of the study is this randomized survey. The centerpiece of this survey is the treatment, where we expose the respondent to the opinion that was randomly attributed to the respective spokesperson, according to this randomization that I just described. In order to prolong a bit the exposure time and to have more friction and interaction between the respondent and this speaker attributed opinion, we included a mock task where we asked people to summarize the speaker's opinion in a few sentences. So this took a couple of minutes to do. Before the treatment, we actually had a pre-treatment survey where we elicited from the respondents their opinions, pre-treatment opinions about the 4 topics, and we elicited their attitude, their empathy towards the 4 spokespeople that they would encounter. We did this via a test that measured the empathy by showing a picture of the spokesperson next to a picture of a painful situation, like here's someone getting their hand stuck in a car engine lid, and psychological research has validated that this kind of response is a valid measure of empathy. And then after the treatment, after the exposure to the quotations, we measured the same things again. So that is, we measured again the empathy for pain and the opinion on the topics. And then our outcome measure is the post minus pre-treatment difference between, in terms of opinions and empathy. Our respondents were recruited via Amazon Mechanical Turk. They were US residents only. The sample size was predetermined via a power analysis. We ended up with about 400 respondents, which is what we had pre-calculated. And as I mentioned, 4 responses per respondent, because each respondent gave us 1 response per condition, i.e. per spokesperson. Okay, so let's move to the results. We look here at the opinion change for each of the spokesperson conditions. On the x-axis, you see the 4 conditions that we had: disagreeing opinion from a liked celebrity, and so on. And on the y-axis, you see the after minus before treatment difference in terms of the opinion about the topic. So this is the opinion change on the y-axis, expressed in z-scores, so in standard deviations. Upwards, positive values mean opinion change towards the opinion expressed in the quotation, and down, negative numbers mean opinion change away from the opinion expressed in the quotation. As I will make the results pop in, I will also populate this matrix on the bottom right, so we can compare our hypotheses to the actual results. So let's start. First thing we saw is when we attribute disagreeing opinion to a celebrity, no matter whether the celebrity is liked or disliked by the respondent, we didn't observe any significant change in opinion. Okay, so there go 2 no's into this matrix. If we look at the expert condition, where we attribute a disagreeing opinion to this anonymous expert, then we see a negative opinion change. That means an opinion change away from the expert's opinion. Since the expert disagreed with your prior opinion, this is a hardening effect. So people harden their previously held opinion if we expose them to a disagreeing opinion from an expert. And now, so there goes a no, another no in the matrix. And then if we look at the condition agree, dislike, then we see a positive opinion change. That means a change towards the opinion expressed in the quotation, but since that opinion agrees with the opinion that you already have, this also is a hardening effect. So people strengthen the opinion that they had before the exposure. Remember that we had hypothesized / hoped that we could maybe steer people away from the opinions that they used to have by showing that people that they dislike have the same opinion, but this is not what happens. So the psychological logic seems to rather be, if even that idiot agrees with me, how wrong can I possibly be? So that's our interpretation of the effect that we see. So let's take stock quickly. We had hypothesized that cleverly attributing opinions, disagreeing opinions to certain types of spokespersons might make it possible to soften extreme opinions, but unlike that hypothesis, we didn't observe any like this. We observed opinion hardening or no opinion change in all the conditions. So that was about opinion change. Now let's look at the empathy change. So you see the same setup as before, the 4 conditions on the x-axis, and what you have now on the y-axis is the change in empathy towards the spokesperson. So positive values are an increase in empathy, negative values decrease in empathy. What do we see? We see that if there is an agreeing opinion, then there is no empathy change. This is what you have on the very right. But if we expose respondents to disagreeing opinions, then there's always an empathy drop, regardless of whether the opinion comes from a liked or a disliked celebrity or from an expert. So we see this as some sort of emotional backlash at disagreeing speakers. Let me summarize in a nutshell. Our best efforts at depolarization failed when there was disagreement from a celebrity spokesperson. We saw no significant opinion change, regardless of whether the celebrity was liked or disliked by the respondent. When there was disagreement by an expert, we saw opinion hardening. And when there was agreement by a disliked celebrity, then we also saw opinion hardening. And at the same time, we saw an emotional backlash at disagreeing spokespersons. We saw that empathy for disagreeing spokespersons drops. And I didn't show you this result, but it's in the paper. We also saw that disagreement by liked spokespersons leads to language change. People also typed a small blurb about before and after. We saw language change that indicates a violation of expectations. So punitive behavior, basically. Let me pop out and spend a few minutes before I wrap up on the research timeline that we progressed in here. In the middle of this project that I described, the COVID pandemic started, and our results that we already had collected from our survey worried us a bit, because we saw that authorities all over are struggling to convince people to wash their hands, do social distancing, get vaccinated, and so on. We observed celebrities left and right coming out and blurting "stay at home" on all social media channels. And based on our study, we were worried that none of this might work. So we pushed the analysis of our main study, of our main survey on the stack, and designed another version of the study with the following question in mind. If I want to convince people to comply with social distancing measures, whom should I enlist as a spokesperson? And based on our previous survey, we feared that the answer might be nobody, that nobody might work as a spokesperson. So we designed a survey where we started by explaining what is social distancing. So there's a short definition. And then we said social distancing has been publicly supported, among others, by, and then in this blank, we filled in the picture and the name of a celebrity or of an expert or of a government spokesperson. And then afterwards, we, this was randomized. Afterwards, we measured how willing are people to share that message about social distancing on their own social media. So that's our outcome. And importantly, this was a randomized design, right? So whenever someone entered the survey, we randomly picked one of these celebrities and attributed the opinion to them. Interestingly, so we ran this via Facebook ads. That's how we recruited people. And in the process, we got our Facebook ads account blocked, and I haven't been able to get it unblocked. So if there are any Facebook people in the audience, please help get our lab's Facebook ads account blocked. This was all bona fide research, and we want to use it in the future. Okay, so with that, let's look at the results, and then I will wrap up because I'm already a bit over time. What you see here is on the x-axis, the 5 spokesperson conditions, including a no speaker control condition. And on the y-axis, you see the willingness to share the message about social distancing on your own social media. So higher means more willing to share. What we saw, to our positive surprise, is that experts actually play a role here. So the expert, Anthony Fauci, was most effective at convincing people to share the social distancing message on their own social media. And celebrities, especially Kim Kardashian, who had been very vocal about social distancing, celebrities were the least effective. Okay, so I just showed you a glimpse here. The full paper is cited at the bottom. There are many more results in there. One important difference between this COVID survey and the previous main survey is that Fauci is a real expert, whereas we had fictitious expert in the previous study that I described. So this brings us to future directions. Obviously, there is a certain mismatch between the two studies that we ran, right? The role of experts was quite divergent in the COVID study versus the main study. And we're wondering, why is this? Is it because we used a real versus a fake expert, or is it because we in one situation we had a crisis, pandemic situation, in the other survey we had business as usual, basically. So I think we need to do more work here to figure this out. Another thing to figure out is long-term effects. In our surveys, we could only measure short-term exposure effects. Already there, we saw a significant hardening of opinions, although this whole thing took place in only about 30 minutes or so, and already we saw this curling up of opinions. So what will happen long-term rather than short-term, I think, is an interesting and important question. We should also elucidate the psychological mechanisms that underlie the reasoning on the behalf of respondents. For example, we hypothesized that when there is an agreeing opinion from a disliked celebrity, that the reasoning is, if even that idiot agrees, how wrong can I possibly be? And I think further research should drill into the heads of people basically to see how are they thinking about this. And then finally, everything I talked about was in a dyadic setting, right? We reasoned about a pairwise relationship between respondents and celebrities, and then we argued about this tension between agreeing and liking. But in real life, in societies, we don't have dyads, right? But opinions are voiced in societies, in social networks. And so I think it would be very interesting to kind of go back to these theories about social balance and so on, and see whether we can kind of crank up the cognitive dissonance until the path of least resistance for a respondent is to just soften up their opinion instead of changing their attitude towards the spokespeople and having an emotional backlash against them. So all of these strategies, of course, assume what's underlying all of these strategies is the hope that opinions don't follow a one-way street, that people don't fall into a black hole from which there is no way back once they hold an extreme opinion. But I'm optimistic that in principle it's possible to soften extreme opinions. Yes, behavior change is hard, but also people manage to stop drinking, to quit smoking, and to change all sorts of other behaviors all the time. Humanity has developed nifty tricks to make those behavior changes possible. And I hope we will find such tricks to also make it possible for people to open their minds and listen to each other in all the directions. So with that, thank you, and I'd be happy to engage in any discussion that there might be.